Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the 20th Annual New Sweden History Conference, Home on the Delaware, Vernacular Architecture in the Delaware River Valley between 1600 and 1767. I'm Luann DeCunzo, and it's my pleasure to introduce one of our speakers today, Wade Katz. Wade is the president of South River Heritage Consulting. He's a native Delawarean and was educated in anthropology and history at the University of Delaware, and is now a registered professional archaeologist and an internationally recognized historian and historical archaeologist who has examined farmsteads and agricultural landscapes, urban development, military engagements, changing environments, with special interests in Middle Atlantic regional and African American studies. He has more than 35 years of research experience in archaeology and history, historic preservation, and cultural resource management, and he's worked on projects across the eastern coast of the United States, involved in all sorts of projects involving archaeological fieldwork, historical architectural research, exhibition, National Register nominations, etc. He also has an extraordinary record of service to Delaware and to our profession. He's a past president of the American Cultural Resources Association and of the Delaware Academy of Science, and has served on the Newcastle County Preservation Review Board, to cite just a few examples. In 2016, Wade received the Archibald Crozier Award for Distinguished Achievement in and Contributions to Archaeology from the Archaeological Society of Delaware. Today, his presentation is entitled, "The Walls Are Not Nearly as Good as They Appear on Paper: Archaeological Evidence of Fort Casimir, Trefaldighet, and Neiuer Amstel between 1651 and 1679. Welcome, Wade.
Thank you, Luann. I appreciate your very kind introduction, and I want to kind of introduce this session or this paper by letting you all know that this is work that was done most recently in 2019. The archaeological field work was done at the site of Fort Casimir in Newcastle. And I will be talking about that work, but I'll also be discussing the earlier archaeological work that was conducted there in the 1980s and in the early 2010s, or about 2012, actually, the work was. The project was one that was funded by the American Battlefield Protection Program. It's a grant that was received or was provided to the Newcastle Historical Society. So it's important to recognize that the American Battlefield Protection Program is a branch of the National Park Service which looks at America's battlefields. Part of what we did here was to examine the battle in 1664 that when the English captured Fort Casimir, and essentially ending the Dutch occupation or use of the Delaware River Valley or the South River. What I'll focus on today is the fort itself, the architectural evidence that we have for the fort, and the kind of information we have, what some of our working hypotheses are now about how that fort might have looked and how it was configured. This was very much a international project and a multi company project. I'm with South River Heritage Consulting, and so I led the project, but the field work and much of the artifact analysis and support work and logistics was handled by Dovetail Cultural Resources Group with Bill Liebknecht and Kerry Gonzalez. We also were able to have a 3D imagery of the fortification done, so you'll see that as I go through this process. That was done by Brian Crane, who's president of Archae 3D. The Newcastle Historical Society was a great partner in the work that we did, along with the Archaeological Society of Delaware, and most especially Hans van Vesting, who came from the New Holland Foundation in the Netherlands, and came and was able to work with us for the extent of the project. So this was very much a project that benefited from that group on the project team. We had a lot of other volunteers as well, and I'll recognize them later in the presentation. To orient you all, you're probably all familiar with the area that we're on, the Delaware Bay and Delaware River, and the site itself is located in the town or the city of Newcastle. Not a long distance below Wilmington, but on the Delaware River, and it has a very early storied history to it. This is an early component of that, what we'll be looking at. There is an allure, as I put it, of Fort Casimir that in about a century ago was identified as the starting point in the history of Newcastle, and keeping in mind that Alexander Cooper was essentially referring to Euro-American occupation and starting point for the history. It certainly is a statement that says that this is the space where early Swedish, Dutch, and English settlers came and began to colonize the area, recognizing that the Lenape and other indigenous groups were still also in the area. There's been a lot of discussion about what that fort looked like and how it might have been configured, how it sat on the river. You see the drawing that Alexander Cooper worked on in 1905, based on the one drawing that we have of the fort, which was prepared by Per Lindström in the 17th century. That will be, that image, and I'll show that a little bit later, is the image that we use, kind of the basis for trying to understand the fort and how it's configured. Another view of the fort, prepared in 1951 for the view of Newcastle in the 17th century, shows another perspective view or thought about how the fort looked. And then there's more recently one that was prepared by Len Tentillo, published in his book, The Edge of New Netherland in 2011. This was based on more recent studies of archaeological sites, particularly in the Hudson River Valley, contemporary descriptions, but also on the archaeological work that had been conducted by Ned Height in the 1980s of what the fort might or might not look like. So we've had a number of different views of the fort and how it's configured. We were using those as part of the basis for the field work that we conducted here to try to understand the site. The location of the fort is in Newcastle, as I indicated, and it's up along the edge of what is Broad Marsh and Broad Marsh Creek that comes in, or Broad Creek that comes in on the north side of the town. You see this aerial image that shows Emmanuel Church location, the courthouse museum, but you get a sense of where the fort sat at that time. The village of Neiuer Amstel, as it was known at the time, sat on a rise of ground known as the Sand Hook. And in particular, the fort was located in a spot that's referred to as Bull Hill. Much of the archaeological work that we did has confirmed that large portions of Bull Hill have been cut and removed over the succeeding centuries from when the fort sat there. But there still is an archaeological remnant to the fort, and we have a sense now of where that fort actually was located on that landscape. In kind of a brief overview of the history of the site and the history of the colonies of both New Sweden and New Netherland. When the Dutch colony centered on the North River, and then which is the Hudson, the Dutch come down into the Delaware River Valley and seize the fortification in the 1650s, and that, while that ends Swedish rule or dominance, if you will, of the valley, Swedes do not leave the area. They are still settled in the area at the time. Fort Casimir falls to the English in 1664 after they initially attacked the New Amsterdam at what is today New York, and then sent an expedition down to seize by force the fortification. Hence the reason that this was an American Battlefield Protection Program grant. There actually was an exchange of fire here, and there were deaths and casualties in the battle for the fort. The fort's brief history, if you will, gives you a sense of its construction periods. Built by the Dutch in 1651, captured by the Swedes, renamed Fort Trefaldighet in 1654, recaptured by the Dutch in 1655, and then it goes through a variety of names. Casimir is still applied to it, but eventually it's Neiuer Amstel when the New Amsterdam, or the city of Amsterdam takes over the colony. In 1664, the fort is captured by the English and referred to sometimes as the Delaware Fort or Fort Newcastle. But by 1671, the fort site has been abandoned. When the Dutch recaptured Newcastle in 1673, no effort is made to repair or work on the fort. The Dutch returned Newcastle to the English about a year later, and by 1679, the fort is ordered to be demolished by the local landowner in order for him to do whatever he wants to do on the property. I mentioned the Per Lindstrom map, and you see it imaged here, or the Per Lindstrom drawing. You see it shown here on the right-hand side. This is probably what you could consider to be what I want the fort to look like, and not necessarily perhaps what the fort actually looked like. And so you have to take that into account as we went through the archaeological work, that the elements of this fort may or may not be exactly what happened here. The value to this is that there is a scale that he provided, the Rhinelander scale that you see across the bottom, and so we were able to apply that in the project that we did here. This is the only detailed sketch of the fort that we have. There are other sketches that show a fortification, but not to the level of detail that this is. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of fortification that Casimir should have been. And it would have been what's referred to, it was constructed in what's referred to as the Old Netherlands style of fortification. And the preeminent practitioner of this method of construction was Simon Steven, a Dutch engineer. He is the most widely read authority on fortification construction in Europe, and certainly would have been the person who most heavily influenced a fortification built here in 1651 and then rebuilt essentially by the Swedes in 1654. That Old Netherlands style includes forts that are earthen walls, wet moats if you can have them, although that may not be the case, and we certainly don't think that was the case here at Casimir. But an important component to that is the salient angle of the bastion, and the largest angle should be about 65 to 75 degrees. So that salient angle is the tip point area of the bastion. It's important to understand this, that Steven's book, Sterkenbouwing, or Fortification Construction, was published in 1594 and reprinted in 1624 in Amsterdam. Per Lindstrom and other engineers would have been highly familiar with this, and this is the style of fortification that you're looking at. The old Dutch style is supplanted by what's referred to as the New Netherlands, the new style, or the New Netherlands system, which you see illustrated on the far right of that image. But it's important to keep in mind that that style of fortification isn't coming into vogue, if you will, until almost a decade after the English capture the fort in 1664. That new system is championed by Vauban, who some of you may have heard of before, but if you'll notice that his whole process and the whole method of fortification doesn't begin to take effect until after the fall of Fort Casimir. So it's important to realize that we are looking at an old Netherlands style fort, not a later construction of Vauban. Now, if you want to look quickly at other fortifications up and down the South River, you can see Trefaldighet or Casimir in the image on the left, also shown in the image in the center. These are period drawings. They clearly show a four-bastioned fortification. The documents indicate that the fort had four bastions, and so we were anticipating that we should be looking for something that would be set up along that way. The Fort Christina fortification is shown here about 1654, also illustrated by Lindstrom. It's clear from the documents that the fort that the Dutch built in 1651 must have been an extremely quickly constructed fortification. They did not have time to build a very heavily well-designed fort, if you will. Lindstrom makes it clear when he shows up in 1654 that they nearly had to rebuild that fort from the ground up. So that first fort, that first 1651 fort, we probably have little, if no evidence, archaeological evidence of that. It's the Swedish fortification, the footprint that Lindstrom designs, and then the later Dutch fortification, a repair and work on it in the once the Dutch seize the fort, that is likely to be the period that we are looking at and we can identify archaeologically. Other fortifications in New Netherland that are similar fortification styles. You can get a sense of what they look like, but it's important again to keep in mind that there is variation in the way these forts are constructed. So here you see Fort New Amsterdam, Fort Albany, or Fort Orange. We also looked at fortifications in other parts of the world, and you can see here in Brazil, in Ireland, and in South Africa. The variation for forts built in that first half of the 17th century is considerable. While there may be guidance as to how you do this, it's important to realize that there is kind of as-built work that gets done, and you tailor your fort to the location that you're building. In particular, I draw your attention to the fort in the center, the Fort de Goede Hoop, 1653. That fortification, in the process of constructing it, they realized that the walls are not accurately being created because they didn't have the right tools when they laid out the footprint of what the fort was supposed to look like in the first place. So there's going to be variation to the way these forts get constructed, and that variation is important to keep in mind as we look at what we have archaeologically. So the Lententillo image is the one that we can keep coming back to. He used as much archaeological data and contemporary historical data to try to get a sense of what the fort would look like. You see that fort with 4 bastions. There's discussion of buildings that sat inside the fortification, and then what you don't see very clearly here is a ditch that goes around the fort, and it's important to recognize that that ditch has to be there in order to create the earthen walls and earthen embankments that would be used to build that fort. Touch a little bit on the earlier work that was done in 1986 by Edward Ned Height. He published an article in the late 80s that basically stated Fort Casimir has been found. He based that on the recovery of Dutch fine ceramics and utility wares, brick and roof tile fragments, clay tobacco pipes, and a clear, deep feature of some sort, deep trench or deep hole that he identified all these items coming out of. The problem was that he didn't know exactly what part of the fort he had when he did this, but he recognized the significance of the fort and the significance of the space. That what he had was a 17th century, mid-17th century occupation of some sort. In 2012, additional work was done here, consisting of principally of a large trench, one long trench that a number of archaeologists worked on. We reconfirmed that Height's 17th century conclusion was correct. We relocated a number of Height's earlier test units, identified what might be a palisade or wall line to the fort, and again, a portion of the ditch. And you can see here a range of the artifacts that were recovered from that project, very similar to the things that Height had identified earlier in the 80s. But once again, we still didn't know exactly where we were. Now, I've mentioned Tentillo's volume that he published on the fortifications on the Delaware River. And this is the most recent artist reconstruction. Tentillo suggests that the fort sat high up on the sand hook, and you see it placed here on the highest ground, and that would be essentially what's referred to as Bull Hill. He also went ahead and tried to map out what the configuration of the fort would be, and kind of what we found here is that the dimensions that he's using are not accurate to what it is that we have found in the ground on the site. An idea of what a wall system would have looked like. This is kind of a short wall, but it still gives you the sense that you see where the ditch and the dirt would come from is on the right-hand side. Some kind of a wooden palisade that has to be built to hold that dirt in place. It creates an earthen wall of some sort that you're going to be able to find. Archaeologically, we could find the ditch. We might be able to find the palisade section as well. We were hoping to identify bastion locations and any other elements of the fort that might be there. So the question was in 2012, and again in 2019, what part of the fort do we have? And there was a lot of discussion here about where we were and what portions of the fort we had. We weren't sure, based on the historical data, what elements of the fort we would be looking at if we did additional work. We don't know exactly where the fort sat on that landscape, so we were trying to figure this out. We had a number of possibilities. The fort itself, an element or a feature called the water battery built by the Swedes, but apparently destroyed relatively quickly after the Swedes constructed it when a nor'easter blew through and pretty much took out whatever was considered to be the water battery. Or did we have the waterfront? So the fort kind of slides back and forth here until we could figure out what portion of the fort we actually had. So in 2019, under the American Battlefield Protection Program project, there was a National Park Service prospection workshop done here where a number of geophysical techniques were applied in the parking lot area, in the location of the fort. Ground penetrating radar turned out to be the most useful in terms of what sat in the parking lot. GPR had already been done for the 2012 work, so we had some sense of what was already out in the field area that you see behind these houses. The field work that we conducted in 2012 consisted of a number of different elements. We were doing shovel tests and excavation units. We did backhoe work, provided by both the city of Newcastle as well as an Archaeological Society of Delaware volunteer, John Fehrenbach. We did, once we cleaned those spaces with the backhoe, we tried to shovel skim and map in any obvious feature locations that might be on the site. The excavations ended up looking into a number of different elements of the fort, and we were able to identify different parts with some depth, I might add, but in other areas, the Palisade Line and things are very, very close to the surface at this site. So a sketch drawing of what we have shows we identified what we think is the ditch or dry moat, a causeway, a gateway that led into the center of the fort would have been the gate entry on the riverside. Possible gate posts associated with that causeway, and what we think might be remnant Palisade Line. On an aerial image, you see what those look like, the excavation areas that we did this, and you can get a sense, even though you probably have to turn your head to see that, you can still at least see what it was we had in mind. And how close to the parking lot it sits, and where some of the excavation areas were. To give a general view of what we had, I've described what we think we have there. You can see where the causeway is located as you look at the archaeological site. The gate posts are located on either side of that berm or causeway, and we think what we have is essentially the ditch excavates to a certain location. The Dutch excavate that ditch to a certain space, and then in order to cross the ditch, you don't excavate the causeway to the point where you have to bridge it, or you have to make it hard to get in and out. There probably was a footbridge of some sort, or a wooden crossing, but not a large crossing of some kind. You can see the beginning of the cross section where the ditch or dry moat is, where the blue dotted line runs through. The white dotted line indicates what we think is the remnant of the Palisade Line. The Palisade Line would have been sitting immediately behind the ditch. It would be the wooden shoring that essentially holds up the earthen embankment, or the earth that came out of the ditch. Photogrammetry of the site gives you a rough idea of, again, where we think the center of the ditch line is, or the edge of the ditch line, which you see shown in purple, and then the possible outline of the fort shown in blue on that aerial. And when you pull all that together, we have one of the 3D models that Brian Crane was able to produce, and you get this image of what we think the fortification looks like. The Lindstrom profile used that Rhinelander feet, which is about 12.3 inches to the English foot. If you convert that to feet and use that on the landing on the property that we understand we have, you get a fortification that measures about 177 or 178 feet from the tip of the southeast bastion to the tip of the northeast bastion. We know the gateway, based on what we found archaeologically, is located at the center of that curtain wall, and the curtain wall measures approximately 100 feet in length, again, based on the archaeology, because the excavation worked to the point where we just began to pick up the elements of where the curtain wall was turning to go into the bastions. If you use those measurements, you end up with about a 38.5 foot face for each of the bastions, and when you get that, when you use that as the calculations, this is the scaling and the size of the fortification that we have. You can see here that the ditch is fairly well defined. The causeway or the gateway is identified, and the fortification walls are shown. I would say that if you go to that Sketchfab page, you can also spin these around and do all kinds of cool things with this map. Brian did a really wonderful job on this, and this all will show up on the Newcastle Historical Society webpage so that the archaeological work that we did here will be interpretable or presentable to the public. Just to give a rough idea of that Palisade Line, again, you can see Hans is working here on a portion of it. There's very, very little left of this Palisade Line, which underscores the fact that a large portion of Bull Hill has been sliced off of this space. That ditch line should have been several feet into the ground, and instead you're only looking at a few inches that go with the Palisade Line, not the ditch line, the Palisade Line. So probably somewhere between 3 feet to maybe 4 feet of hillside have been cut off of this space. So the line would have been much deeper into the ground than you see there. The ditch or dry moat that you see shown here on the left, you can kind of understand where it is. It's identified as TU14 or test unit 14. It's clearly a ditch space that drops down. It's a dry moat that you have that's approximately 100 feet long. That red line that you see there essentially marks the interior side of the moat. We think the moat is about 15 feet wide. We only sampled that moat, so about 90% of that ditch or moat are still intact. So future archaeological work here could be done to really investigate this site more fully. If you want to see it in profile, I think this is a really good image of what you see. There's the drawing of the profile and the photograph that show you the same thing. The interior or scarp wall is intact, very clearly defined, and you can clearly see the footprint of that ditch as it kind of works its way up to the left. On the river side, on the counterscarp side, that section of the ditch has been damaged by a variety of things. Sea level changes or erosion, principally erosion, storm erosion, but also later construction and use of this site in the 19th and 20th century. This was the site of the location of the Newcastle-Pennsville ferry, and a large terminal was built in this location. As I said earlier, we think the ditch is about 15 feet wide, and it appears to be essentially trapezoidal in profile, which is fairly common for period ditches of the 17th century sites like this. The causeway and gate post configuration that you see here is shown in the aerial image on the left. You can see that the green arrow identifies a possible gate post. The red arrows are the base of the earthen causeway. The blue arrow up in the upper corner is a portion of the Palisade Line, and the white arrow, just so we were able to actually ground our work in the earlier work that Ned Height did, is actually one of his post hole tests from the 1980s. So we're able to overlay all of these projects that have been done over the years, over the decades, to be able to identify this. So I draw your attention to the Tentio drawing. You can see how the gate would be configured. The ditch that should be there isn't clearly shown, and it probably could be added to this to be able to clearly identify that those walls are earthen with wooden framing that holds them in place. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of artifacts that we found in the ditch that relate to the construction of the building itself. We recovered about 11,000 grams of brick, many of which, almost 200, more than 200, were whole and partial yellow brick, clearly identified as Dutch construction or Dutch brick. We also had roof tiles, lots of red roof tiles, over 4,600 grams of red roof tile fragments. If you look at the descriptions that we have from the period when Jacob Ulrichs was the vice director, he is consistently calling for the need for bricks and for tiles. You can see these quotes from some of his reports. What this suggests is that the archaeology that we have of the ditch is associated principally with the Dutch work that was done on this fort after they began to do the repair work, not Swedish, but Dutch. The fact that he has no brick in the buildings themselves, that they need roof tiles, that comes back to the inheritance essentially of this fortification from the Swedes when the Dutch seized the fort. And the roof tiles are actually not, they're wooden shingles, they're not brick, there's no red roof tiles like pan tiles that you see there. Something else that supports that is the number of nails that we found. We got a fairly large number of nails. And again, Ulrichs calls for the need for a whole range of nail types because he needs them to put together the buildings that not only make up the fort and the way the fort is constructed, but also the houses that are in the village itself as it's being developed. We also recovered window glass from the trenches, from the little bit of sample that we did of the trench. Not a lot, but some that suggests that these are rectangular casement panes, very consistent with 17th century buildings and windows that you might find in 17th century houses. And of course, it's a fortification, so that over the years, a number of pieces of shot have been found in the ditch, some of which came in the work that we did, some of which came from the work that was done in 2012. I draw your attention to the 6-pound crossbar shot that you see in the lower right corner. That seems to be associated with one of the English naval vessels that came and attacked the fort. The Dutch do not have 6-pound guns inside the fort based on what we do know about the gun configuration, but the English do. They have 6, 8, and 12-pound guns on the ships that attack. So in all likelihood, that crossbar shot is from one of the English vessels that fired on the fort in the engagement in 1664. As I mentioned, we only sampled the ditch, and I kind of want to leave this with what kinds of information is in that ditch. Here you see one of the archaeologists, Tim Hitchens, working on some of the amazing Dutch material culture that was found at the bottom of this ditch. That is a nearly complete vessel that is pretty unusual to identify in this configuration. It's been essentially thrown into the base of the ditch. It was broken at the time, and then you can see that a portion of it is there. But we also had a broad range of Dutch material culture that came out of this ditch. And as I noted earlier, we only sampled this, so the range of material culture in this ditch is pretty remarkable. From Dutch redware vessels that you see across the top. The one I just showed you that's in the ditch is in the far right-hand corner. But there is also faience and maiolica that was recovered here. The small object in the center is glass, some kind of probably a Dutch glass. A prunt that you see, or a bramble in the lower right-hand corner, is also off of a drinking glass of Dutch manufacture. So this ditch is essentially chock full of fantastic Dutch material culture that we could gain a lot more information about the fort and the occupation of this site in future archaeological work if it could be done. So the results of that 2019 investigation were able to identify the length of the front or curtain wall of the fort. We determined that this is actually the fort that we identified based on the fact that we have those locations where the bastions are starting to turn to curve. It's not the Swedish water battery that was constructed. The period descriptions indicate, as I said, that the northeaster took out that water battery and is not rebuilt. We recovered nearly 700 artifacts from the work we did. We can now virtually put the fort back on that land, and this helps us understand the attack on the fort from the perspective of the American Battlefield Protection Program. But it also helps us understand how this fort is configured and sits in the town, the city of Newcastle now. So if you pull back, you get a sense of how that fort sits and what its configuration would be. Note, if I did the overlay here, you'd see that the Lententillo drawing that suggests that the fort sat on the tip of Bull Hill is not correct. The fort is now closer to the intersection of Chestnut Street and 2nd Street. And this is another one of those 3D images that gives you a sense of how the fort looked and what we think how you would have seen it on the landscape. I would argue here also that further archaeological work can help us further define whether we've accurately defined where the bastions would have been, what that curtain wall length would be. There are a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to here, but I think we've got some really remarkable data that had not been seen before about the fort. So with that, I just want to leave you with kind of a shout out to the number of volunteers and people that helped us on this project. We had over 700 hours of volunteer time. Tremendous support from the trustees of Newcastle Commons, the City of Newcastle, Newcastle Historical Society, a large number of professional archaeologists and avocational archaeologists assisted in this project and really made it a success. And we were able to have a great public component to this as well. And just thank you for listening, and I will look forward to answering questions, I think, in the question and answer session that occurs afterwards. So thank you very much. Luann, I'll turn this back over to you, I think.
Thank you, Wade. That was fantastic. It's really wonderful to see all these decades of work finally coming together and understanding what's been happening on this piece of land, especially the 17th century early fortification. So I would like to conclude just by reminding everyone to join the live panel discussion with Wade and our other speakers on Saturday, October 31st, between 1 and 2 p.m. Please email your questions in advance, and you can also reach out to Wade directly. The discussion will proceed as will be directed when you register for the conference, which you will be doing in a few days, and we look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks again, Wade.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Luann. This was great. Hope it works out well.